Hello. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Brian Anderson. I'm with Climate Action Bainbridge. I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Climate change, of course, is the defining challenge of our time, and I appreciate that you're taking a couple hours out of your weekend to come and join us here. We have a great topic today. We have a couple speakers. We had three. So we're going to be hearing from Andrea, Rodgers, who is the lead attorney for Our Children's Trust. That's the organization that is bringing the lawsuits against the federal and state governments. We were going to have one of the plaintiffs in the Washington state lawsuit, but unfortunately he's come down with an illness and is not going to make it today. And then we're also going to hear from a local high school student, Charlotte Larson Freeman, who helped organize the climate strike for the climate, school strike for the climate on March 15th. These are the sponsoring organizations for this. Citizens Climate Lobby is the national organization that lobbies at the U.S. Congress for a carbon fee and dividend. And we have a very active chapter here on Bainbridge Island. Climate Action Bainbridge, a group that I'm part of, we mostly focus on Bainbridge Island and Washington State. Island Power is the organization that was lobbying for public power here on Bainbridge Island a couple of years ago. Eco-Adapt is Laura Hansen's group that helps companies and governments come up with plans to adapt to the climate change. And Sustainable Bainbridge, umbrella group of environmental organizations on the island, and all things sustainable. Next slide. Actually, before I get into this, how many were at our previous forum last month? It was just a couple weeks ago. Great. So we talked about adapting to climate change here on Bainbridge Island. And of course, being an island surrounded by seawater, the biggest challenge to us is going to be the rising seas. We looked at maps of Bainbridge Island. There are going to be certain roads which are going to need to be moved or abandoned, utilities along the shoreline that are going to need to be moved. And of course, it's going to be a big challenge for property owners. That forum was recorded and is available on our website, bainbridgeislandforum.org. So if you missed that, go up there and check it out. It's very good. I'd like to hit, so the way today is going to be structured is I'm going to talk at you for about 10 minutes. Then I'm going to introduce the speakers, and we'll hear from the speakers, and then we'll have at least a half hour for Q&A, so please hold your questions to that. I'm just going to cover a couple climate-related news items. I heard an interview with Hillary Franz the other day, the Commissioner of Public Lands here in Washington State. She was talking about the fact that Washington State right now is in a major drought again. If you may have noticed that Governor Inslee has declared a state emergency or emergency for about half of the state due to drought. We may have another summer like last summer where we have wildfires and we have the worst air quality in the world. Most of our forest fires have occurred west or east of the Cascades in the past. One of the big changes in the last few years is that more than half of our wildfires are now occurring west of the Cascades. We've already had a record number of forest fires just this year. So get ready for another tough year with fires in Washington State. And I have to mention this guy who's running for president. He has proposed a plan, Inslee's emergency evergreen economy plan. And I just want to mention this because this is the sort of bold plan that we really need to rise to the challenge of climate change. Spending $9 trillion of public and private money over the next 10 years. I hope that this gets a lot of discussion in the Democratic primaries and some of the other candidates adopt it. I loved what The Onion said about it. That seems like a lot of money to save a single planet. But go ahead and learn more about this. So since we're focusing on young people today, I wanted to talk about Greta Thunberg. I knew a little bit about her, but in preparing for this, I really dug into it, and I was really impressed with what she's been doing. So she started her school strike for the climate last August, hasn't even been a year, after Northern Europe experienced extreme heat and dryness. Sweden, which is a largely wooded country, experienced their worst wildfire season ever. They had fires all the way up to the Arctic Circle. And her and some of her friends were inspired by what the Parkland, Florida high school students had done after their classmates were murdered. They organized a nationwide action for calling for gun control legislation. They wanted to do something they couldn't agree on what. One day, Greta decided she was going to go down to the Swedish Parliament building with her handmade sign and leave school every day for the next 3 weeks until the next parliamentary election in Sweden. She wanted to bring attention to climate change, and she also wanted the Swedish government to be more aggressive in their cutting of carbon emissions. And Sweden has actually lowered their carbon emissions more than most countries. Greta was not new to with her concern about climate change. When she was 12 years old, she fell into a severe depression. She suffers from Asperger's syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, and so she's really had drilled in on this. She talked to her parents, and they said, well, what's wrong? She said, one of the things that's bothering me is climate change. And her parents did what any parents would do. They told her everything's going to be all right. Well, her parents didn't really know that much about climate change. You know, like a lot of people, they were busy with their lives. They didn't pay that much attention to it. It was a problem that somebody else was going to solve. She educated them over time. She showed them documentaries. She had them read books and articles. And eventually, her severe depression passed. In a couple months, she was able to go back to school. So she started her strike. The first day, she was the only one there. The second day, some of her classmates joined her. And other adults joined her. One of her teachers joined her. They were out there. They were getting a lot of journalists coming down and talking to them. And people were really hearing her message. This is a shy girl. She has trouble speaking up in her friends group, but she was finding her strength and making her impact. So over the next 6 months, she was invited to speak all over Europe, the European Parliament, the UK Parliament, the Extinction Rebellion gathering in London, Helsinki, Finland, next slide. The World Economic Forum in Switzerland, the UN Climate Conference in Poland. One thing you may notice about all of these locations, they're all in Europe. When she was 15, she made a commitment that she would not fly in an airplane again because of the carbon from that. So she traveled to all of these places by either electric car or train. She has convinced her parents. Her mother was an international opera singer. She used to fly all around the world. She convinced her mother to change careers so her lifestyle didn't need to produce such a large carbon footprint. She's also convinced her parents to become vegans. Next slide. A couple new words have snuck into the Swedish language recently. How many know what flygskam is? And this other one is a little less popular, tagskirt, train bragging. So there has actually been a shift of people in Sweden away from flying for long distance trips towards trains. So she might have something to do with that. She was also a big inspiration for the School Strike for Climate, which was a worldwide strike that occurred on March 15th. 1.4 million students walked out of school around the world in 133 countries. Next slide. I'd like to read you a few quotes from Greta. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day, and then I want you to act. You don't listen to the science because you are only interested in solutions that would enable you to carry on like before, and those answers don't exist anymore because you did not act in time. Of course we need hope, but the one thing we need more than hope is action. So instead of looking for hope, look for action, and then and only then hope will come. No, I am not more hopeful than when I started. The emissions are increasing, and that is the only thing that matters. And the emissions just crossed 415 parts per million a couple weeks ago. Next slide. So this shy, quiet girl who found it difficult to speak up in her friends group now spends a significant amount of her time preparing speeches and speaking on the world stage to people about climate change. She is a great example of how people can overcome their anxiety and really make a difference. She's still out there in front of the Swedish Parliament in Stockholm every Friday with her sign, School Strike for the Climate. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker for today. This is Andrea Rodgers. Andrea earned her law degree at Arizona State University Law School in 2001. She has served as an attorney for the U.S. Department of Transportation, in-house legal counsel for the Snoqualmie Indian Tribe, and staff attorney for the Western Environmental Law Center. Her environmental law practice focuses on reducing pollution from industrial agricultural operations, protecting and enhancing in-stream flows for people and fish, and fighting climate change on behalf of young people and future generations. Andrea is senior staff attorney at Our Children's Trust, where she serves as co-counsel on the constitutional youth climate lawsuit against the federal government, Juliana v. United States, and is lead counsel on the constitutional youth climate lawsuits against the state of Washington, Aji versus the state of Washington, and the state of Florida, Reynolds versus Florida. A few months ago, I met Andrea at the South Sound Climate Conference in Olympia, where she spoke about the work of Our Children's Trust. I really wanted to bring her here today to speak to this forum here on Bainbridge Island. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and always such an opportunity to come to Bainbridge Island. It's so beautiful. I live on the other side of the Sound. So these are the plaintiffs in the Washington State climate change case. There's, starting from the left, it's India, Aji. Aji in the back, he's also a plaintiff in the federal case, and Aji was invited to be on the first panel to testify in the Climate Crisis Select Committee in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., and he did that a couple of months ago, which was a pretty cool opportunity. Their first whole hearing was hearing from youth. Next to him is his brother, Adonis. Jamie Margolin is beside him, and Jamie founded Zero Hour, which is another amazing youth climate movement. Bodhi is to the left. He's our youngest plaintiff. In front of him is Kailani. Kailani is a member of the Colville Indian Tribe. And her dad works for Upper Columbia Tribes and has been working on restoring fish in that region of the Columbia for his whole lifetime. And in the front, that's Athena, and Athena is a student in Seattle. So that's our Washington plaintiffs. I will also be mostly focused on Juliana, just because we have a huge oral argument coming up on Tuesday. And that's, if I have brain fog, it's because I've been reading nothing but standing cases and listening to oral arguments for the last, 2 weeks. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk too much about the science because I know I'm here with a group of experts, but I just want to give you a little bit of background about what our litigation is about, and I'm going to do that in the context of our experts. So we have the case of Juliana v. United States. It was filed in 2015, and since that time we've been on a quest to get into the courtroom. We received a wonderful decision, and I'll talk about that. But we did get a trial date last year, and it was October 29th, 2018. So predominantly our 2018 was working with our experts to finalize their expert reports, which they did, and we served those on the federal government. We have 23 of the world's top climate and energy experts who are all donating their time pro bono to the youth, including Dr. Jim Hansen, Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, and others, and I'll talk to you in the context of their work. They submitted their expert reports, and we did 50 depositions, took and defended 50 depositions in a matter of 60 days, last August, September, and into October. It was crazy, and all because the federal government, their delay tactics, but we got it done. So we have an amazing body of evidence. Expert reports are really a cool way to see the science condensed in a way that judges need to understand it. So we have all of those expert reports. That's part of our evidence in the case. And this is one of my favorite graphs. This is in the expert report of Dr. Harold Wanless. He's our sea level rise expert. He's at the University of Miami. And he likes to show this graph because he's in Florida. So Florida is quite different from Washington in terms of climate reality. They had Governor Scott for the last 8 years, who did to Florida what Trump is doing to the United States in terms of climate policy. But Scott was more effective. He came into office, and everything that the previous Governor Christ had done on climate literally evaporated to such an extent that state employees couldn't even utter the words climate change. Their work turned to weather modification and things like that. So we do have a case on behalf of 8 youth in the state of Florida. So I know about that. So Dr. Wanless likes this because it answers, it responds to the notion that climate, yes, has changed in the past, and this is sort of what it looks like in our geologic past. But what's also important for purposes of Dr. Wanless's expert testimony is that it shows the close correlation of carbon dioxide, global temperature, and sea level rise. So we can understand what happens when Brian was talking about carbon dioxide concentrations being at 415 parts per million. We have a sense of how the Earth responds to that. Now, what we don't know is, you see at the far upper right corner there, is we've put so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're doing it 100 times faster than it's ever been done before. So those kind of responses and positive feedback loops and things that happen with that's what we're in the middle of experiencing, and what our younger generation and our children will be facing to an even greater extent. Next slide, please. So the last time carbon dioxide concentrations were where they are today, seas were about 70 feet higher than they are today. You can let that sink in. That's where we're headed. And this is again in Dr. Wanless's report. And I asked him, to explain to the court, well, maybe the court would wonder if that's the case, then why aren't sea levels 70 feet higher? And that's just because it takes time for us to melt the ice, and it takes time for the oceans to absorb the heat and to expand. So we are on the point of that happening. Dr. Wanless explains that sea levels in the past do not rise linearly. They rise in what's called pulses. So he has another graph that shows these sea level rise pulses. He thinks we're at the precipice of one of these pulses today. And the reason they know that sea levels rose in pulses is because you'll see these drowned coral reefs all in different parts of the world, particularly in the Caribbean, where a lot of his research has been done. This is just a map of what the southeastern United States would look like with 70 feet higher. In the federal Juliana case, one of our plaintiffs lives in Rain, Louisiana, so her home would be underwater. Levi, our youngest plaintiff, lives in Satellite Beach, Florida, on a barrier island. His home would be underwater. His home will likely be underwater no matter what we do, because he's on a barrier island. And we've already passed that tipping point to save his home and his cultural connection to the place where he's grown up. Next slide, please. Here again is the calendar curve. A big part of our case is what the government knew and when they knew it, because we have to prove that their conduct shocks the conscience in order to prove liability in our case. It's much more stringent standard than mere negligence. So we have a long record of government knowledge of climate change. The science, we've known the basic scientific principles for decades. There's no mystery there. A trick question that a professor at Stanford asks his students is, what are the major developments in climate science since 1979? It's a trick question because there are none. We've really refined our knowledge, but the basic scientific concepts have been known for a very long time. This is where we are going and where we're headed. Next slide, please. Our oceans, there's a lot of research coming out like gangbusters, and our challenge is keeping up with it all, really. So oceans have already absorbed about 93.4% of the excess heat caused by climate pollution. They're our buffer. They have saved us tremendously in terms of the warming that we would have experienced to date. A new study came out. One of our experts, Dr. Kevin Trenberth, he's our causation expert on attribution science. They came out with a new science showing that our oceans have actually increased, their warming has increased, it's 5 times greater today than it was in the 1970s and 80s. So it's much faster. The oceans are warming much faster than they thought was going to happen, which is quite terrifying because that has a number of consequences. Next slide, please. Including ocean acidification. Our ocean acidification expert, his name is Dr. Hugh Gouldberg. He's at the University of Queensland in Australia, and so his expertise is on the Great Barrier Reef. And when you see the impacts on coral reefs, it's just devastating. It really is the canary in the coal mine. The bleaching events are happening so frequently now that there's just no way for the reefs to recover. If you go onto the NOAA website, they have some, they're helpful for liability, but disturbing as a human and a mother. But they have projections in terms of they can tell where the bleaching is going to occur because of ocean temperatures. And there's a lot of red on those maps. They're predicting some significant bleaching events later this year. And, you know, the consequences for the marine life and the humans who depend upon these reefs is obviously tremendous. One of our plaintiffs named Journey, he lives in Hawaii. He's on the island of Kauai, and so reefs are a big part of who he is and his cultural identity, and those impacts are terrifying. Dr. Ove's testimony is also really important because fortunately, in terms of the court setting a standard, oceans have the same scientific standard of protection that the atmosphere does. So scientists have opined that we need to get down to about 350 parts per million in the atmosphere in order to preserve a stable climate system. And it's about 350 parts per million in the atmosphere as well to preserve our coral reef systems. So that's helpful for us because of that correlation, but of course, we have a long way to go. Next slide, please. Here, as you know, the National Climate Assessment was released the day after Thanksgiving from the Trump administration last fall. One of the documents that, you know, all of the agencies do supporting scientific work, and this came from an EPA document on coral reefs. And this was one thing, you know, I read about scary science is a big part of my job, and we all sort of become numb to it, unfortunately. But this was one of those moments when my jaw hit the floor. And I was looking at this because we amended our complaint in Florida with the new science from the climate assessment, just because it's in Florida and it would be helpful for a judge to see that this is coming out of the Trump administration and not, you know, other entities for political reasons. But, you know, if you look at South Florida's reef, it's gone. It's pretty much died and gone, and it won't recover. And they characterize the reef, the impacts to Florida's reef as, quote, particularly dire. And, you know, this is not something that the people in the state of Florida have woken up to. But it's quite terrifying, and the waters are just too warm. They've likely already reached the tipping point of no return in South Florida. So it will have significant consequences for that state for many different reasons. But looking at this science, to communicate the urgency, I think this is a very good and effective way to do that. Next slide, please. And again, just some more on ocean acidification. I saw, you know, up there about the oyster group, you know, that comes and talks, and there's been a lot of scientific studies. The Pacific Northwest is really, you know, they're doing a lot of work on shell formation and oysters and how that's impacted. This is a great, you know, opportunity also for young people to do the science firsthand. They have some great scientific experiments where you can literally do ocean acidification in a jar, and you can come up with results like this. I did that with my son for his science fair project, and it is pretty startling when you see the damage that's done from ocean acidification, and something that we're living with here today. And again, so part of what our cases are, we don't sue governments for failing to act on climate change. That's not what our cases are about. Our cases are challenging the energy system that the governments create, right? So our governments set the plans and policies and how we're going to get our energy. That's created by our governments in a variety of different ways. And you'll see here, you know, this is United States emissions, just our fossil fuel emissions. You know, the vast majority of them are coming in some way they're connected to this energy system. So I think the easiest way to know that, in every administration creates their energy system. So Bush was drill, baby, drill. Obama, all of the above. Trump, American energy dominance, right? But what all of the administrations have had in common is that the energy plans that they create and energy systems that they perpetuate have all been based on fossil fuels. Obama, he takes credit for making the U.S. the largest oil exporter. He's very proud of that fact for some reason. Trump, we just filed with the court. The White House just issued a fact sheet. And we need to come up with a better word than bragging, because I don't know, but that's how I would describe it, just bragging about the energy production, the fossil fuel energy production. And I don't know, if you heard of Mad Libs, my daughter Vivi, who's here, she loves to do Mad Libs. Well, at the White House, they have an adjective guy, because it's not just they withdrew from the Paris Agreement, they withdrew from the terrible Paris Agreement. They're not just drilling oil, they're drilling massive amounts of oil. And so there's an adjective guy in there in doing this in all their fact sheets, which, it's startling, but you can see there's no question. What is our energy policy in the United States? It's fossil fuels full speed ahead, in spite of the knowledge that we know about climate danger. Next slide. So you had a great slide up there on Governor Inslee, who's one of our most prominent climate leaders. People are like, well, why do you have a case in Washington against Governor Inslee? Well, here's why. Here's our energy in Washington. We're not that different from other jurisdictions. We're very lucky we have a lot of hydro. Salmon may say something else about that, but here's where we are. And during Governor Inslee's tenure, emissions rose 6.1%, which is about double what national emissions have risen. So it's not a matter of Governor Inslee not getting it or not wanting to do something. It's the fact that the system is broken. And what we have learned through time is when we have systemic failures, all three branches of government must get involved and engaged. With the civil rights movement, we had bus boycotts, we had Brown versus Board of Education. With the gay rights movement, we had the Love is Love campaign, we have the Obergefell gay marriage decision. The judicial branch needs to get engaged and set the standard and ensure that things keep moving forward. Here in Washington, what we're most familiar with is McCleary versus State, right? Where we couldn't figure out how to fund our education system and our schools. The court said, you weren't doing it well enough. We're not going to tell you how to do it, but we're going to hold you in contempt of court and fine you $70,000 a day until you do it. Wouldn't it be great to get a court order saying change your energy system and stop harming our children, and if you don't do it, we're going to fine you $70,000 a day? That's the kind of court order that we need in climate, and so that's why we're pursuing our case in Washington State. Next slide, please. Okay, here's what we do. We represent young people. We work for people like Greta. A lot of our clients have been, giving testimony and writing letters to Congress. And frankly, they were sick of the process and sick of being told, oh, we're proud of you, good work, pat you on the head, and then they go vote for another pipeline. And so they recognized that they needed to get engaged at a higher level. And so that's what we do. We advocate and elevate the voices of young people. A big part of our work is we only advocate for science-based and legally enforceable remedies. So as great as, cases that challenge individual pipelines and as critical as those kind of cases are, we are at a different level. We're challenging the underlying system, and we advocate for remedies that scientists say are needed to protect youth. You won't hear us advocating for Paris Agreement or 1.5 degrees because our experts tell us if that's where we go, it's catastrophic for our children. In our case, it's really fundamental human rights approach. These are constitutional cases. These are not statutory environmental cases. Next slide, please. Here's just a picture of some of the youth that you could see. Aji's in the middle. To his on your left here, that's Alex Loznick. He just graduated from Columbia University. We're really proud of him. Kelsey Juliana is right there on the far right. She's the lead plaintiff in our case and one of our guiding stars. She's quite amazing, but it's a wonderful group of youth to work with. In the middle, that's Jacob. He lives on a farm outside outside of Roseburg, Oregon. He's, the wildfire smoke around his property is particularly scary because he's afraid it's going to come in and take away his whole heritage. Next slide, please. Here's again what we're doing, challenging the energy system. We also have not only constitutional claims, but claims that are brought under the public trust doctrine, which is an ancient legal doctrine that says that sovereign governments have a responsibility to hold essential natural resources in trust, not just on behalf of current generations, but future generations as well. So the government can't squander the resources so that younger generations aren't able to access and utilize them. We have a wonderful body of public trust law here in Washington State, and our argument in Juliana is more novel. We're trying to get it applied to the United States government. We have good case law and support, but that's one of the claims that the defendants are trying to dismiss in our case. Next slide, please. And again, it's really important to recognize that we're challenging all sectors of the energy system. I think part of the messaging has gotten tough today because you see a lot of these 100% renewable bills, and the vast majority of those are just focusing on electricity. They're not focusing on transportation or other aspects of the problem. So it's really important that we remember we're talking about all of the sectors, whether it's building and industry and land use, and our energy experts that we work with, they work on on a sector-wide basis. Next slide, please. And again, I wanted to, here's one of our inspirations in Claudette Colvin. She was a key leader in the civil rights movement, not only acting on the ground or in the buses, but also in the courts of law as well. And, I think we need to take that history lesson to heart, and that's why it's so exciting to see young people that are really leading this movement, because it's been young people through history that have led us on the path that we need to go. And as an adult, it's inspiring and wonderful to see, but at the same time, it's upsetting because it really demonstrates our failure to protect our children and to lead them in the direction that we should be leading them to go. And fortunately, we have leaders out there who are can really understand the science and cut through the crap. This isn't something we have to be living through. It really isn't, and they see the possibilities. And I think that's what's so inspiring about the work that we do. Next slide, please. Here are claims under the Constitution, just a little bit of law. So you have substantive due process rights to life, liberty, and property. Normally, that doesn't require the government to do something. You can get the government to stop doing something. So that's why we're trying to get the government to stop perpetuating a fossil fuel-based energy system. But we also have what's called a state-created danger claim. And you may hear some questions about this when Julia argues on Tuesday. So what that doctrine holds, it's really an exception to the substantive due process. And it says if the government is the one to place somebody in a position of danger, that government entity can be held responsible for the consequences that happen. Here's the context where it usually happens most frequently. Police officer arrests a drunk man. Instead of who obviously can't take care of himself, instead of taking him home or bringing him to the police station, they leave him on the side of I-5. The drunk person then wanders into I-5 and gets hit by a car. That officer can be held liable because he should have known that placing somebody who's unable to take care of himself on the side of a freeway is a highly dangerous situation. What we are saying is because the government has knowingly perpetuated a fossil fuel-based energy system, even though they know that it places our children in a position of danger, that they should be liable under that theory. It's a very novel application of the doctrine to the set of facts, but boy, does it fit perfectly. One interesting place you've seen this applied is in the Flint water crisis. They argued that because they knew by changing the water system and taking the water out without the treatment, they knew that people were going to get poisoned, but they did it to save money. And so they've applied it in that context of exposure to pollutants, and so that's how we're applying it in our case. Our case is about fundamental rights. I'll talk talk a little bit about the fundamental right to a stable climate system, but we also have other claims: life, liberty, property, personal security, and other attributes of your liberty rights. Those are also arguments that we're making. Cultural identity. One of our plaintiffs, Jamie, she's Navajo, Diné Navajo. She had to move off of her traditional land on the Navajo reservation because the springs dried up and they couldn't maintain their land. And moving off of a reservation, there's a lot of cultural consequences associated with that. So that's part of our constitutional claim. We also have an equal protection claim, which was predominantly the claims in the civil rights cases and the desegregation cases, the school desegregation cases. We're arguing that they are discriminating against children in pursuing these fossil fuel energy policies with respect to their fundamental rights. And we also are advocating that because this case involves harm to children, the court should apply higher scrutiny. So there's a line of cases starting in the Supreme Court where courts give extra protection when children are the victims and children are the ones who are being harmed. So we're asking for that to be applied in our case as well. Next slide, please. In November of 2016, so about a little over a year after we originally filed our case, we obtained a beautiful decision denying the government's motion to dismiss from Judge Ann Aiken in the District of Oregon, where the case is filed and pending. And this is where she recognized a fundamental right to a stable climate system that sustains human life and liberties. This is very different from a right to a healthy environment or a right to be free from pollution. This is more about your right to life and your right to exercise all that's needed in order to sustain your life. And that's an important distinction because in this country, not the same in other countries, but in this country, courts have been very hesitant to find that there's a fundamental right to a healthy environment. They don't like that concept in American jurisprudence. But when it's tied to a right to life, that's where I think we're starting to see some progress here. In Washington, the legislature has recognized that you have a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment. That's the only right that the legislature has called fundamental and inalienable. Isn't that amazing? And that's what we're trying to enforce in our Washington case. But this is what Judge Aiken, her language is quite beautiful and strong. And to hold otherwise would be to say that the Constitution affords no protection against a government's knowing decision to poison the air its citizens breathe or the water its citizens drink. And that's what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with affirmative conduct that is knowingly contaminating our world and the lives of these children. Next slide, please. So again, I talked a little bit about, the importance, why we go to courts to do this. And this is a phenomenon that's happening all over the world. Juliana is perhaps the leading climate change case, but there's cases being filed in all other parts of the world. There's cases in Colombia, the UK, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India. So it's really exciting to see youth really elevating their voices on different levels. We support cases in other jurisdictions as well. We have cases in a number of states, but we also have cases in other countries. We have another big one that's about to be filed, so stay tuned. We're really excited about that, but that will be coming. And I think courts are and scientists particularly are look to the courts as the last bastion of hope. This isn't a policy issue. And so what our experts have told, Julia in preparing for the argument, one of them told her, make sure you communicate to the court that time is not our friend on this issue. We just don't have the time to figure out how to do this conveniently. And Greta really communicates that, I think, quite effectively, right? So that's why courts can implement and require a plan immediately. And while the court process takes time, courts can really change dialogues very quickly. And we've seen that in a number of contexts throughout our history. And that's what we're hoping to obtain in our climate cases. Next slide, please. So the scientists that we work with, they were asked the question that many people don't ask. Many people don't ask the question of what is safe. where do we need to go in order to protect and restore the energy balance that we've disrupted from our conduct. And the scientists that we've worked with, there's quite a consensus on this, that we need to get down to below 350 parts per million by the end of the century. If you're talking to an ice expert, they'll say you need to keep going after 350 to get down to about 280 in order to preserve all of our ice sheets and to eliminate the worst sea level rise. So this is, and we asked all of our scientists, and we thought this would be a hard question because I think in the climate community, people are always leery of whether this is a scientific question. It was the easiest question for us to ask our experts. It was very easy for them to answer. They knew the answer to this question, and there was, consensus across the board. So that's what we're asking. That's the standard we're asking the court to set. Right? So another example of constitutional cases where courts have done this is in the prison overcrowding situation. There's a case called Brown versus Plata that was affirmed by the United States Supreme Court. And there, the prison inmates alleged violations to their Eighth Amendment rights because they were unable to get access to health care, mental and physical health care in the California prison system. So they had a trial, and what they determined, the main problem is overcrowding. It wasn't that they didn't have good policies, it was that there were too many people. So the court said, okay, if that's the reason for the constitutional violation, we're going to deal with that problem. And they said, so they had experts testified, what is the standard so that it's not so overcrowded that we can't provide medical treatment? And so they came up with different standard, and they heard testimony. The court ultimately landed on 139.5% capacity. If the prisons are at 139.5% capacity, it's more likely than not that most prisoners are getting adequate medical care in order to remedy the constitutional violation. So there it's even more arbitrary than 350 parts per million, because there it was really just experts saying, based on social science and other things, this is where we think we need to go. But that's what we're hoping the court to set in our case. Can the U.S. get there by themselves? Absolutely not. But that's not our burden. We don't have to prove that the U.S. can solve climate change. We have to show that what the court can order will meaningfully address the youth's injuries. And because the United States is responsible for about 25% of historic cumulative emissions, what the United States does matter. Okay, next slide, please. And the way to get there, it's not only emissions reductions, but it's also reforestation and protection of soils. Our expert on that front, his name's Dr. Philip Robertson. He's at Michigan State University, and he has done an assessment as to what is the sequestration capacity for the lower 48 in the United States, and it's quite a lot. It's amazing. We have real potential if we were to change our forestry and land management practices. And we're talking about regenerative agriculture. There's some grazing practices that can be implemented. He goes through a whole list of different practices that can be encouraged by government. Government manages a tremendous amount of land, and we lease public land for grazing and timber, right? Well, there's ways that can be done in a way that increases our carbon sequestration capacity as opposed to not being factored in at all. We really, a lot of folks focus in on the emission reductions because that's so important. And, this is minimum 8% annually starting in 2017. We're in 2019. We're getting up to about 10%. We're getting very close to being too hard to handle, where society just can't handle that kind of drastic change. So the happy experts, the ones that we really like to work with, are the energy experts, because they're the engineers, and to them this is just a problem that needs to be solved. This is not, a moral conundrum, and they've all, there's been a lot of work done. The consensus is that we need to transition off of fossil fuels, all sectors of our energy system, by 2050. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is all sectors, the transformation that we're talking about. This is not just our electricity sector. In 2050, that's for the United States. For a state like Washington, where over 60% of our electricity is already considered green, we should be talking about 2030, 2035. Delaying longer than that is just preposterous. Our experts, they just came out with a new study opining that it's technically and economically feasible to get the U.S. off fossil fuel in line with a 350 parts per million trajectory. That study just came out a few weeks ago. It's being peer reviewed. It's really exciting to see because they were the first one. They're the experts who did the deep decarbonization work. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they essentially just turned up the dial, and they came out with that it was economically and technically feasible. So Tuesday, this is a big day, and I hope 2 o'clock your eyes will be fixed on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals YouTube channel, which does exist. Everything has a YouTube channel, including the Ninth Circuit. We will be arguing what's called an interlocutory appeal. I know it's Saturday morning, it's a little early for judicial terms, but so after we won our decision in November, we were headed to trial. And since that time and today, the federal government filed 12 motions to stay the case. We have been to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals 5 times, the United States Supreme Court 2 times. All of those courts have agreed with us and have paved the way to trial. This latest hiccup is an early appeal of Judge Aiken's decisions denying their 2 separate motions to dismiss, their 1 motion for summary judgment. And she granted an interlocutory appeal because at one point in this case, we were filing briefs in the district court, the Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court simultaneously. And so she said, you know what? I think this needs to go to trial. There's questions of fact. We cannot resolve these important constitutional questions without a fully developed factual record. The Supreme Court has said that a number of times in other cases. But if this is going to go up, you guys be the one to affirm that this should go to trial. So that's what we're arguing about on Tuesday. We hope that the argument on Tuesday, I hope it is the most boring experience for you. We don't want the judge to weigh in on climate change. We don't want the judges to talk about the fundamental right to a stable climate system. We don't want them to talk about equal protection of the law. We want them to recognize that there's questions of fact that we need to get to trial and treat this as a procedural procedural problem and get us back so we can get in the district court. That's what we're hoping for. Whether that'll happen in terms of questions, you never know. It's very difficult to project that. But my colleague Julia Olson will be arguing. She is more prepared than any other human on earth for an argument. She is articulate and tough. She's the founder of our organization and the heart and soul of this movement. And what she has done for young people is remarkable. So you will be very proud to see her standing up there. She's arguing against Jeffrey Bossert Clark, who's a Trump political appointee to the Environment and Natural Resources Department, who doesn't believe in climate change. It's a climate denier, which we're kind of surprised that there hasn't been any articles, news media articles about that. But that's the reality that we'll be facing. There'll be thousands of people coming to Oregon to support the 21 youth, most of whom who will be in attendance in the argument. There'll be a gathering in Director Park, which is close to the court. The argument will also be live streamed at the court there. Children around the world are planning press conferences to bring attention to the oral argument and to support the 21 plaintiffs. So you can see that in Variety. I know there's going to be one in Seattle. So that will be happening as well. And for those who know social media, I don't. All eyes on Juliana is the hashtag. When I wrote it out, I put the number sign at the end, and that was my colleagues clearly understood that that I don't know what I'm doing, but it goes in the beginning. So please, watch our last argument before the Ninth Circuit. We had more viewers than the Trump Muslim ban argument. It was one of the most watched arguments. So please tune in and let not only the court, but everybody else know what's happening. And then in terms of ways to get involved and to support our litigation, one of the efforts that we're doing now is we're reaching out to our Congress people, and we're asking them to recognize and publicly state that there's a fundamental right to a stable climate system that's protected by the United States Constitution. This is part of the work that Aji was doing when he testified in Congress. And I work with youth a lot. And this was one of my favorite moments. We were sitting in a meeting with Senator Ed Markey's staff. And we're talking to his staff. They're smart. They knew the stuff. And in walks Ed Markey. He's Senator Massachusetts. He was in the House for many, many years. And he's a, talks with his, East Coast Massachusetts accent, how you doing? It comes down, talks to us. Your case is about standing, right? Standing, that's the problem, which is true. So he's a lawyer. He understood this. Talking. I said, so Aji is sitting there, and Aji said, well, Senator, I'd like you to recognize that there's a fundamental right to a stable climate system. And Senator Markey looked at him and goes, okay, I'll do it right now. And looks at his staff and said, go get the good camera. And Aji, just the look on his face. How many years has this young boy, he's 18 years old, how many rooms has he sat into saying, oh, we can't do this, you're asking too big, we'll get back to you, it's a good idea, we give you hope. Here's somebody who jumped up, filmed him with Aji, posted it on Twitter within a matter of 15 minutes. For 20 minutes, my faith in government was fully restored. It was beautiful, but that's what we're asking others to do. Sheldon Whitehouse has done something similar. We need all of our elected leaders to recognize that there's a fundamental right to a stable climate system. So that's a way to engage. In our Washington case, in just a week or so, amicus briefs are being filed. If you're a medical physician, there's an amicus brief that you can sign on to. If you own a business, there's a collection of businesses are filing a brief in support of the children. If you are an environmental advocacy organization, there's a brief that you can sign on to in support of the youth. If you're interested in any of those, please let me know. But I think, just to close, going back to Greta and hearing again from Charlotte, what we can do is we have to stand up and be there for these kids. What they're living through is extremely traumatic and difficult to live through this climate crisis with the knowledge that they have. And that's what Gabe was going to talk about if he was able to be here with me today. He was going to talk about how hard it is. It's really hard to be a young person today for a number of reasons. It's very hard to be a young person. But then imagine when you're flooded with scientific information that, where you live and the things that you love just may not even be here. I remember my mom grew up, with the idea of a nuclear winter, and she always drove her car with a full tank of gas because she, as a young girl, you always had to have a full tank of gas to get out if there was a nuclear attack. And that affected her. That trauma followed her all the way her whole life. And so these youth they're experiencing a different kind of trauma. So as grown-ups, we need to be there to support them and to help them and join them, whether it's on their climate strikes or if it's in the courtroom, any way that we can. And I think they appreciate that, and they're inspired by working with elder people in their generation who they see that support them because they're looking out for that. So thank you. I'm anxious to hear from the next speaker. But thank you for your interest in our case and for all of the amazing work that you do. We hope that once we get a ruling in our case, all of the work that's being done by Citizens Climate Lobby and others, you guys got to have the policies ready. Because once we get that court order, it's going to be getting those policies implemented by the legislature. So keep up the great work. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker, Charlotte Larson Freeman. Charlotte is currently a high school senior at BHS. After deferring for a year to travel and live abroad, she will be heading to Western Washington University. There she hopes to major in political science and possibly environmental science. An environmentalist her whole life, Charlotte has recently become more engaged through groups like BHS Earth Service Corps and Citizens Climate Lobby.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Brian, for that introduction, and thank you, everyone, for putting this together. I'm really honored to be here speaking today, especially after Andrea. Thank you so much for that support and everything you're doing. It truly is inspiring. Right. I am a senior at Bainbridge High School right now. I've lived on Bainbridge Island my whole life. And growing up in this generation is incredibly interesting, I think, because we are growing up in a time where climate change is an absolute reality, at least in this part of the country anyway. People understand that, people believe that, and people realize that it's incredibly important. My mom grew up in national parks, and my dad is a physicist, so I grew up with that mindset that you always need to take care of the world around you and that it's important and that climate change is real. And so I kind of took for granted what a lot of environmentalists don't, or what a lot of environmentalists don't. Because, now climate change isn't just about switching your light bulb, and it isn't just about saying, let's use a reusable water bottle. Climate change now is about making policy. Climate change now is about making legitimate changes in your everyday lives, in your thinking. And my generation has grown up with that, but our legislators haven't, and that's where the disconnect is. And I'm really excited, too, to see young people here. This is amazing that you're here, especially on a Saturday morning. Okay. Yes, yeah, prom last night. So I think, too, the reason that I put this photo up is, again, I grew up with this photo. And I think a lot of you in this room probably didn't grow up with this photo. And just imagine that impact, like seeing this as our planet, understanding the way the whole system works. Last year I took an amazing class at the high school, AP Environmental Science, with Mr. Eitflecht. And there are so many people at my school who understand that climate change is an issue and that it's real, but don't really know what to do about it beyond saying, yes, it's real. They think that they don't really have any power because they're young. They think that it doesn't matter if they do something because we live in a liberal community. But if they actually look around at the laws, if they actually look around at what's happening, then they start to realize that there are problems. It's just they don't know what to do, and they don't realize that they have power even as youth. Next slide, please. So before I get into all of that, just going into some things that I found pretty shocking in the recent IPCC report. I was reading through it recently before the climate walkout on the 15th, which I helped organize. And I just remember last year the forest fires that we had here. I spent most of the summer working outside, and by the end of the summer, I just went on a very quick run, and I started to have what my doctor described as an asthma attack because I had been exposed to so much smoke. And that was here in Western Washington. And we're going to have twice that in 30 years. And I'm a perfectly healthy person. I've never had asthma before. And this kind of thing happens to so many people. Next slide, please. 99% of coral reefs will be lost if we get to 2%. 99%. I will never get to go see coral reefs. People in my generation will never get to see coral reefs if this is what happens. Next slide, please. The way the colors are in here, you actually can't tell very easily, I don't think. But this is a graph of the United States, and it's talking about GDP and the loss in GDP that we are going to experience if we reach, by 2080, for every degree of warming that we have. Because climate change isn't just about what you think about in your natural world. It's not just about when you go outside and you see the evergreen trees. It's not just about the air like I was talking about. It's not just about the coral reefs. Climate change is about economics. Climate change is about politics. And climate change is going to be about mass migrations. Because all of the things that are happening in our world, they're going to affect productivity. When heat levels rise, studies show that people are less productive. They become more agitated. They become more likely to be violent. We're going to be experiencing droughts, and that is going to, as experts say, is going to cause wars in places. And so many people are going to be experiencing extreme heat stress, especially south of our border. If you think we have an immigration problem now, and people are having trouble figuring out what to do with that, just imagine in 2080. That's not that far away. That's in my lifetime. Next slide, please. So the reason that I was asked to speak today is because I have recently become involved in activism about climate change as a youth. And in preparing for this, I decided to look at what people have actually been doing aside from me. Of course, I've been watching the news, but I wanted to read a little bit more. And the first thing that came up was Andrea's lawsuit. That was one of the previous plaintiffs for the lawsuit, Mr. Martinez, up in the top left-hand corner. He, in 2015, joined the lawsuit, and then you said that he left it. But now he is a musician, and he's continuing to advocate for a better climate. Jack Harris, next to him, he is a YouTuber. He started out just as your regular YouTuber, and then he started caring about climate change. He started realizing what was happening as he traveled the world, and as he saw in different places how people were experiencing the worst effects of climate change. And then, of course, there's who Brian talked about, Greta Thunberg. She is absolutely incredible. She's so young and she's doing so much. And what's truly amazing to me is how effective I think her activism has been. I think a lot of the reason why we see not very much change happening in policy for climate change is that activism isn't always effective. If you don't make people listen, then they aren't going to care. If you don't make people angry, they don't care. But you also can't bulldoze over people, because when you do that, they don't listen to you either. It's this happy medium you have to go for. And I think Greta Thunberg does that really well. She's direct, she's honest, she grabs your attention, but she doesn't bulldoze. And she's very intelligent. And the thing too about her is that she is so young and she looks young. And that has so much power. And I think young people today don't realize how much power we have. Walking into a room as a young person who cares about climate change, as a young person who's informed, it shocks people. They might say, hey, that's great, you're here for climate change, oh my gosh, let's take a photo with you. But they don't want to actually know what you have to say most of the time. They might think, oh, that's great, she's here. But they don't realize that you have something to contribute. They don't realize that you actually care beyond, oh, I care about Mother Earth. You know, that's not it. My generation is growing up with the facts. We're growing up learning it in school. We're growing up experiencing it. And when we walk outside, we know about the facts, we care about the facts, and we're trying to be effective. And that's what I think you're seeing here with the walkouts that are happening. People are caring, people are interested, and people are engaged. So many young people have been walking out of class. We shouldn't have to walk out of class. We shouldn't have to leave school because we're worried about our health and our future. We shouldn't have to leave school because we don't want wars in the future. That's not right. That's not right for our politicians to put us in that situation. And the Green New Deal, I think, is a very interesting piece of legislation that's brought up. Resolution, because it got so many young people engaged. It really did. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has been kind of a catalyst for this movement, but I think it's unfortunate because people have started perceiving it incorrectly. There's so much misinformation about the Green New Deal. There's so much misinformation about what's actually in there. Lawmakers have turned it into an argument about the politics of it and not about what's actually in the Green New Deal. I recently read a study that shows that if you read an article that even has partially of the information about the actual politics of something, you can have like a paragraph about the politics, and then the rest of the article about the actual legislation, and the thing that most people remember more than anything else is the politics. So if we don't start changing the way that we cover this type of information, then we're never actually going to fully understand what we're facing here. We can't be fully informed unless we actually go and dig our teeth in and read. It's only 14 pages. It's very easy. I really recommend you all go read it. Yeah, go home and read it. And one of the things too, when I was walking around the high school talking to people, the couple days before our walkout, because I wanted to make sure people actually understood this was an issue. And most people didn't really understand what the Green New Deal was. They're like, oh, that's the thing about cows. They're banning cows. That's not what it is. Or they just didn't know. And that's another issue, is that we aren't encouraging young people to pay attention. We are encouraging them to actually engage in issues. Even though we say that's really cool and we recognize it when they do that, we aren't putting it in classrooms as much as we should have. We aren't making environmental science a core class. We aren't making that required. There are so many things that we need to teach our young people that we just aren't right now. And I think that's another reason why you don't see as many young people involved. And they just hear it on the news, or they hear a flash of it, and it goes by in a second. And it's really easy to ignore that. It's really easy to push that to the back of your mind. And it's really easy to decide that that's not something for you to deal with, but it is, because it's going to be our lives more than anyone else. My generation is going to be more affected by climate change than any generation previous. We are going to see our homes disappear. We're going to see them burn, literally. Next slide, please. So, our service corps at the high school, I've been involved with for the past couple of years. And one of the things that they've been working on for about a decade is trying to get composting and recycling to actually work at the high school. We live in a very liberal community with so many people that care about climate change, and we aren't actually composting and recycling at our high school. I think that's incredible. We don't care because the students know that our school doesn't actually recycle and compost. We have recycle bins, we have composting bins in our lunchroom, we have trash cans. We have a composter out behind the high school, we have trash, and we have recycling out behind the high school. But our staff doesn't have enough time and isn't paid enough to be able to sort through all of that and put things where they're supposed to go. So students don't care because they all know this. People have been talking about this for so long that they know. And that's why when we did our trash audit, we took some bags of trash from the lunchroom. 60% of that could be commercially composted. A lot of that is just composted, period, in the compost we have right there. And students aren't putting it in the compost because they know it's not actually going to be composted most of the time. 12% of that could be recycled. Now that's a lot better because students understand recycling a little bit more. That's something that we've been dealing with for a long time, and more often than not our janitors are able to deal with the recycling. Only 28% of what was in the trash actually should have been in the trash at our high school. And we have done so many campaigns to educate our students. They know what goes in the compost. They know what goes in the recycling. They know what goes in the trash. But they know it doesn't actually get there. So that's what we're dealing with right now. And we have been working with our administration. We have a new principal from the past year, Ms. Hazlip, and she's wonderful and she really wants to help us with this, but they don't have the funding. And so I'm working with some people in Climate Action Bainbridge about potentially finding a solution for this, and it's looking like the wheels are turning a little bit more. But what's truly exciting to me about this is that we have a lot of young people, like not just young people, freshmen at the high school who are in our service corps this year, and they came in like so unsure about what they were doing. They didn't really know what our service corps was. They heard there were volunteer hours and they showed up. And recently, in the past couple months, they've decided that they want to make sure we get compostable utensils at the high school because we're using plastic forks and spoons and knives at the high school. So many of them. It is crazy how much goes in the trash. And these girls, it's like 4 of them. They become so empowered for it. I sat down at a meeting about 2 months ago, and I said, okay, what do you guys want to do next? Because we just finished a plastic drive, collecting plastic bags to recycle. And they just brought it up. And I think that's what's really empowering today, is that when you start to give youth an opportunity, they will take it. When you start to show youth that they have power, this is how you do it, this will make a difference, you can actually do this, they will. And I think that that's what we need to do. We need to open more opportunities, but not just open those opportunities. We need to make them accessible, because people don't think they can actually get there. They don't think I can actually use that opportunity. That's not for me. I'm too young. No one will listen. They might not at first, but they will. Okay, next slide, please. So the last thing I want to talk about today is food and the environment. Because right now I'm talking to a group of people who needs to hear this message. I think that it's wonderful that you all are here, but young people need to hear this message more than anyone else. So what I want to talk to you all about is food and the environment. Because one of the biggest things that you can do to help stop the worst effects of climate change is to change your eating habits. And I know this is something you probably hear all the time. Yeah, you should go vegan, you should go vegetarian, you should cut back on your beef. Well, yeah, you should. That's the thing. If you actually look at the facts, the amount of emissions that come from animal products is amazing. It is so much, and it is completely unnecessary. If you geographically think about the space that it takes up just in our country to have not just lots for animals that we grow and raise and kill and eat, but also for the food that we grow for them, it is so much space. I encourage you all to go look at home. And it wastes water, it produces more emissions than we need, and you don't need it. You really don't. You are actually healthier if you don't eat meat. The World Health Organization says that it's perfectly good to eat a plant-based diet. They say that you can get the exact amount of protein you need with a plant-based diet. You can actually get more protein than you need as a vegan. 50 grams of protein, that's how much you need a day. 68 grams, that's how much most Americans get in a day. It is perfectly achievable to get 50 grams on a plant-based diet. But I understand that seems like a lot. I have been vegan for 5 years now, but my whole family became vegan a year before I did. I was very stubborn. I said I wanted my cheese and my ice cream and my yogurt. No, thank you. But the thing is, once you start to take control of that, you have to say, look, it's not about what I want. It's about what we all need for our planet, and it's about pushing this beyond me, because it doesn't matter, and it's not good for you, and it's not good for anyone. It just buys into this system that our government incentivizes through taxes and subsidies to farmers to grow crops that we don't need more of, like corn. We don't need more corn, and they subsidize corn. So, if you decide to start cutting things out, I suggest beef as the first thing. Beef, I'm sure you've heard this, but cows create so much methane gas. That is one of the worst greenhouse gases. And there's so many lots that take up for cows. So if you just cut that out of your diet, the impact you have is incredible. And I know on this graph it says lamb is a little bit worse than beef, and that's true, but people also eat less lamb. So beef is more important, especially in America, because that's so culturally relevant. Just go home today and try eating a meal without meat. Just tonight for dinner. See how you like it. If it works, try it again tomorrow. Maybe try it again the day after that. Tell me what you think. If you don't, I'll give you some recipes. I will. Send me an email. But it's not just about that. It's not just about cutting back on the things that are bad for our environment. It's about the whole structure of it in general. Michael Pollan is very famous for talking about this. He says that you should eat a lot of vegetables. He says that you should eat plants, mostly plants. And he also talks about this idea of counter cuisine. So we recently learned about this in my global citizenship class at the high school, which is the last year, actually. It will be required as a class at the high school. And it's the only required class that even touches on energy, different types of energy, or different types of agriculture. And it's only required at Bainbridge High School, it's not required statewide. Counter cuisine is the idea that you need to eat food that is not genetically modified. You need to eat food that is seasonal. You need to eat food that's supposed to be grown here for people to eat. When you eat food that's not genetically modified, that means that we don't have to use as many chemicals to grow that food. That also means that those farmers aren't growing foods that are restricted by companies who own the seeds, because most of the foods that are extremely problematic are the seeds are owned by corporations that have a lot of power over people. And when you decide to switch to a counter cuisine style of eating, that means that you say, no, I'm not going to be participating in that. I'm going to go back to something that's not only healthier for me, it's better for the soil, because those farmers can then decide to grow other things as well. See, when farmers are forced to grow a certain type of seed, that also means that they're forced to do some other things along with it. Not only do they need to use different chemicals to make sure that actually grows correctly in their environment, they also are not usually allowed to rotate their crops. And when you don't rotate the crop that you have on your land, the soil is actually really damaged because you don't get the right nutrients that stay in there. You need to keep rotating different types of crops because different types of plants take up certain chemicals that you need and put back in other ones that you do need as well. And if you keep the same crop on the same land for a long enough time, it becomes a positive feedback loop. You keep taking out stuff that you need for that plant to grow, and that's great, but then the stuff you're putting back in isn't what should be put back in. And so that's when they start using too many chemicals. So to get back to the idea of counter cuisine, the way you can get into that is go to your local farmers market. We have a great one. Go to that, get things from local farmers, eating local. So much less carbon emissions come from eating local. And again, that's eating seasonal food as well. It's about changing the way we think about diet. It's about changing your idea of what's for dinner. It doesn't have to be a hamburger. It can be something else. It should be something else because it's better for you and it's better for our world. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Just a reminder, the farmers market is open till 1 today, so you can just go straight there from here and get your locally grown vegetables. I shop there almost every week. I love it. Now we're going to open it up for Q&A. I don't know if you guys want to come and stand or sit or whatever you want to do. Herb has another microphone, so if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. He'll bring you the mic, and we'll take it from there. Go ahead.
I've got a couple of questions on the lawsuit. Number one would be, if you win, is there any chance that we could get policies that would actually benefit the effects of climate change that aren't politically driven or Wall Street driven, like fuel cell cars, so they can jump up the price of Tesla? Well, policies such as fuel cells. I mean, I would love to have a fuel cell in my cabin, powered initially by natural gas. But I guess under the new bill, that's never going to happen. Secondly, on the defendant side, why haven't you sued people like Kami China and India that are causing most of the increase, and deal with the fact that a lot of this deals with globalization, and I think you should also be suing groups like La Raza that are bringing in a lot of illegal aliens that are causing pollution. I mean, have you ever seen one use an electric blower? I haven't.
All right, those are good questions. Policies. Okay, so what the court will never write the policies. That violates separation of powers. So if we even get into that realm, we are out on jurisdiction. So we have to be very clear that the court can order the standard. So if the court orders the standard, then whatever policies the defendants come up with, they have to meet that standard. So they couldn't come up with policies, like you said, are half-baked and crap because they wouldn't meet the standard. But look what we dealt with in McCleary. We dealt with 2 years of contempt order because the legislature was unable and inept in terms of figuring out how to do this, right? So that's why the work that everybody here is so critical, because we have to have those policies fully developed, ready to be implemented, vetted by scientists so that we know what needs to be implemented. You know, whether it's the fee and dividend, that's ready to go, it's written, here it is, let's get it implemented, right? So that's why it's so critical, but the court will issue the standard. And frankly, you know, I like being in a courtroom more than I like being in a legislature. There's a reason for that, you know, it's called pork. So, you know, I hear your frustration, I understand, but we have to be ready as a movement to know what the policies are so that we don't pass things that are bad, because bad policies stay there forever and they prevent good things. So in 2008, we passed a law here in Washington that mandated emission reductions of very nominal amounts. What has happened is that all of the policies, whether that's the Clean Air Rule, they're all targeted to emission reductions based on that crap law. And even though it looks good, but no scientist would say that it was needed. So we're actually trying to get that law declared unconstitutional because it's only stood in the way, it wearing a cloak of progress, you know? So I hear what you're saying. We have to be very careful about the policies that we support, particularly the 100% renewable stuff. Those can be traps if it's only dealing with one sector. What could happen is, well, in order to meet 100% renewable electricity, let's reduce the demand. Let's really reduce our demand. Well, that's great, except if you want to electrify transportation. How are you going to electrify transportation if all the loads? Yeah, but I mean, you know what I mean? So if you're not doing it on a sector by sector basis, it's very dangerous. And it's, we have to think as a movement, we have to think bigger than that. So I hear what you're saying. China and India. I don't run our global program, but it's my understanding that you cannot file a lawsuit against the Chinese government in a Chinese court of law and survive. There's a number of different barriers for going after China, but because of their government control, if things change, they're going to be able to make changes much faster than we can in this country. India, we are supporting a case in India that is going forward. So I hear what you're saying about that, but the United States peddles and pays for a lot of the fossil fuel infrastructure in places like India, particularly now. That is what our federal government does, is we are peddling this stuff all over the world. And with the Trump administration, even more so, whether it's pipelines in Ukraine or whatever it is, so the United States is playing a big role. So if the court is able to rein that in, that gets hard for us because of foreign policy stuff. But that's a huge issue. But the United States, the reason we don't have binding commitments in the Paris Agreement, it's because the United States has advocated against binding commitments since it was formed in the early 1990s. It's because of us. And so, we're such a large role in this crisis.
Thank you. The other thing I'd like to point out about India and China is China has about 4 times as many people as we do in the United States. So our carbon emissions on a per person basis are about 3 times as high as theirs, and they're about 5 or 6 times as high as those in India. So we need to lead by example, and we have a lot of work to do here at home. But yes, China and India, we need to pressure them to lower their emissions as well.
I want to say the presentation really shifted my understanding of what's at stake, that you're making constitutional claims, defending basically a right to life. And I wonder if it's possible to connect the dots over to the advocacy on behalf of unborn children.
Yeah, I think Charlotte did this for us in her talk. When you were hearing her talk, were you hearing her talk, does she just want a right to a healthy environment? That's not what she was talking about. Charlotte was talking about her life and her future. So yes, in terms of right to life, it's such a loaded issue right now because of what's going on in our southern states, right? But yes, a lot of those laws are supportive of our, and one of the arguments we make is, well, you have a right to life and you have a right to die, but shouldn't you have something in between? How is a right to life meaningful if you don't have a climate system in which you can live? And then in terms of, there's a lot of youth, and I don't know if you've met anybody in this realm. It's kind of different in Washington, but evangelical youth are really mobilizing on climate. And one of the people that Aji spoke with on the panel in the Climate Crisis Select Committee, she's very active. I don't remember the name of the organization, but they are hugely engaged. And one of our biggest supporters in terms of amicus are the Global Catholic Movement, because they also recognize the connection between valuing human life and the right to life. So it is a big part of our case. You have to be careful with it. The right to life, it's complicated, and it's more grounded in privacy and bodily autonomy, which is a little bit different than personal security, but not a lot, So there's those, and maybe Charlotte, you can talk about that too, about what this is. This is about life as opposed to something else.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, the reason that we care about this is because of the things that we're going to lose. The Earth will always be here. That's the thing. The Earth will stay here long past us. Even if climate change keeps going, it's going to be here. What's going to disappear is humans. That's what's going to happen, and everything else. So we want to stop it before that happens. And before humans disappear, we want to make sure that we have air to breathe, water to drink, places to actually go out and enjoy nature, because that is part of our human health. Studies show that people need green, they need trees to actually be healthy psychologically. So it's more than that too, though. It's about all of the romanticized things you hear when people talk about climate change. It's about actually wanting to go out and see the world's wonders. It's about wanting to be in nature. It's about wanting to have that right that all of you have had for all of your lives. And I've had to an extent for mine. But our parents and our grandparents, they got to see more than we did because the climate has been changing for a long time. So that's what this is about.
Charlotte, this is a question for you. You know, I was so inspired, and I came and stood across the street when the thing you organized, the school strike, and the whole idea of strike, that's it, you know, things are going to get shut down, that something beyond even what's working its way through the courts, even the lobbying the legislature, some action step given the scale of this crisis. And I just wondered, at the same time, I was a bit puzzled when it was announced that, you know, they had permission from the teachers or something for 20 minutes and then back to school. And I thought all these, you know, getting ready for college, all of those kinds of pressures. But the inspiring thing about Greta is, that's it, you know. I don't want to be in school because I need to be here doing this. So would you talk about that? And maybe there's an adult counterpart to that direct action. Because one thing students don't do is they don't drive the buses and run the economy. That's a component that may be something to be done. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'd love to talk about that because I think that we did a lot of really cool things, I think, at our climate strike here. And we also definitely did it a little bit differently than most schools. So Bainbridge High School, as I'm sure you all know, is a very academic-centric high school. The students there are very focused on their future careers, their future college plans, and they don't feel like they will actually make a difference if they do something in many situations. So they oftentimes would choose probably to just go to school and not go to an all-day strike because they don't want to miss class. So the other organizers and I chose to have it be 20 minutes. We chose to have it work with the teacher's schedule because the thing is we don't want it to interfere with the school community because we want to be able to work with our school in future events. We had the same thing last year. I was also part of organizing our strike relating to gun control last year, and that was a similar kind of issue. So of course, yes, I would love if we could have a climate strike that was just full-on strike, but I think that the reason we did that is because we wanted to make sure that we got enough people there. And part of that was that we wanted to talk to them about this. We wanted to get them involved in an actual strike, because people who go to events like this, people who go to small strikes, people who go to community events that are like this, they're more likely to vote, they're more likely to be involved in the political process in the future. And they're more likely to be inspired to do something. And I gave a speech and I talked to them about what the Green New Deal was. I talked to them about the IPCC report for 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I talked to them too about what they can do to get involved. Because I think that that was really important, because these people don't really realize that they can get involved, like I was talking about earlier, or that they should. And another thing that we did at our event that was really great was that we wrote letters actually to Derek Kilmer. We pre-wrote letters, one supporting the Green New Deal, one calling for climate change in general, because there were a lot of students, like I said, who didn't fully understand the Green New Deal and weren't going to be comfortable signing that letter. So I believe that we actually ran out of letters, and we sent like 200 letters to Derek Kilmer's office in Tacoma with so many students who signed them. And we had a lot of students at our strike. So that was kind of, in a very long-winded way, why we did that, like that. And, you know, as to your second part of your question about what adults can do, well, yeah, you can strike too. That is definitely a thing. I mean, like I said, though, you know, your job's on the line, my career's on the line. Yeah. Sure, that's, you know.
I will.
One thing I'll say too, and Brian, this is an idea. I don't know if you've had this. Have you had the valve turners come and speak?
I haven't. I've
Okay.
thought about inviting
Yeah,
Mike and them out to talk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think it's really, it's really important to hear their perspective. And these are people who literally put their freedom on the line. Literally, they turn off the pipelines and go to jail. And a really wonderful film was done on one of the valve turners. And I'll send you some information about it. I mean, he's just, he's a man with a son, and this just sort of became a part of his life for a variety of reasons. And
Talking
it really,
about Michael Foster.
no, it's not about Michael Foster. But Michael Foster is one of the valve turners. But you can hear their story. And Leonard Higgins does work with Extinction Rebellion as well. So it's really, it's really interesting to hear their perspective. And again, but these are hard choices because we all live lives, and particularly young people have things that need to be done. So these are really tough questions, but I think that perspective would be helpful to hear.
Well, first of all, I'd like to encourage everyone who can live stream or get down to Portland to go to the hearing. I happened to be in Ann Aiken's court for the one in Eugene when it was first given the go-ahead, and watched her, which was it was the most inspiring thing. And seeing Julia present the case was, I don't know, I've just been moved ever since. But my question has to do with first of all, I guess I was so frustrated to hear there was one more step, but I guess it was worthwhile. I mean, it was about getting facts. I don't know, I couldn't quite understand all of that, but I just want to know.
Nor do I.
Huh?
Nor do I.
Okay. Well, can they run out of appeals? And is this it, or what can we do? I tried talking to Patty Murray and Maria Cantwell. I know they can't. It's legal stuff, so they can't do anything, or supposedly they can't do.
Well,
anything.
they can recognize the fundamental right, and they
Yeah,
can sign on to the amicus brief. That's
yeah.
what you need to ask them to do, because
Yeah.
they haven't.
Yeah. So that's my first question. I have a brief other statement to make, and that has to do with the idea of personhood. And Native American, in their belief system, all the fish, the trees, all are persons. And I know there's a tribal area in the world, I can't remember where, is it New Zealand, I think, that has given personhood to the forest.
The Amazon in Colombia.
Is it Colombia? And I guess when we all talk about humans, and then I think about the fish and the whales, and they don't have a voice. It's not just about us. It's about all the creatures and the trees and everything. And so they have rights too. And that's probably nowhere in your case. That's taking it a step too.
I wish it could be, but that's, our American jurisprudence. It's very human-centric.
But I guess
cases are filed on behalf
the
of
Native
orcas.
Americans are part of our
Yep.
our people, and their belief system is about all those persons.
Yep, and we're trying to bring that in a little bit. Here's how that's relevant in our Washington case, is that at statehood, we became a state, and we, accepted those treaties as, they were in existence before we became a state. And so we're arguing that that's evidence that there's a fundamental right to a stable climate system that's within Washington's history and traditions, because our history and traditions go back before we were a state. And so that's how that's coming in. But I hear what you're saying, and I agree, and we try to bring that in when we can, and but like I said, our jurisprudence is very human-centric, and maybe with the public trust doctrine, that's where that can come in, because that gives the resources more life than any other provision of law, I would say. But in terms of whether they run out of appeals,
Yeah.
I mean, yes, at some point we will have a trial if we're allowed to go forward. And what needs to happen is a decision from the higher courts saying these are questions of fact that need to be resolved at trial. Hopefully the Ninth Circuit will say that, and if they take it up to the Supreme Court, hopefully the Supreme Court will do it. Yep, they'll go there again. They will. Absolutely. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And
We can't do anything.
nope. Nope. We depend upon our judges to make sure that this goes to trial. That's why Tuesday's so important. Well, thank you guys. You guys doing the work.
I wanted a comment and a question. Burger King and Carl's Jr. are now selling Beyond Meat or Impossible Burgers, which is really encouraging. So I think that will commercialize it more rapidly. And the second, you all are such effective speakers, and I've spent a lot of time in Texas living there, and this kind of message isn't getting there as much as it needs to be. Do you travel, or could you do a TEDx talk? Or I wonder, you're a very effective messenger, you both are, and is there a way that, I don't know, you probably don't have enough time, but is there any way you can?
Charlotte
This
needs to
was
do
so
a TEDx
powerful.
talk, and
Yeah.
I'm fortunate. I know the woman who does the TEDx talk, and so will be my email, is connecting you with her, because I think you should do that, because I think that would be brilliant for you to do that. We are working on developing a case in Texas. We had a very early win in Texas many years ago where the court recognized that the atmosphere is part of the public trust. So we are bringing follow-up litigation in Texas soon. So stay tuned for that. But, the youth that we work with, they are speaking all over. They are amazing. They're doing, and you guys are so connected. And so there's people doing things in all over. And so just stay tuned. And we try to give all of those youth a platform through our media work that we do. So I agree with you. I mean, it's just amazing to hear young people as messengers.
Yeah, as Charlotte's message was, I do think, Charlotte, you don't know the impact you have as a young person talking. It does make a big difference.
Thank you. Just responding to that as well. So that is wonderful that Carl's Jr. and you said Burger King are carrying the Impossible Burger? One's Impossible Burger, the other one's Beyond Meat. Okay, Beyond Meat and Impossible. So that is amazing, and that's great, because you're right, that is making it more mainstream to not eat meat and to have other options. But there are still issues with that, though, because those things are still over-processed, so they're still not very good for you. And they're still on buns with cheese sometimes, or other things. And the whole idea of changing the way we think about food isn't just saying we're taking something out, it's saying we're changing all of it. We're making sure that our agricultural practices are actually environmentally friendly. We're making sure that our food isn't shipped long distances because it doesn't need to be. And we're making sure that we aren't going, I didn't talk about this earlier, but going to fast food restaurants, that's not great either, because first of all, the workers there, they do not get paid enough, and their jobs are really bad for their health. Just the tasks that they have to do, they're trained to do one thing. They're trained to flip a burger, or they're trained to put a bun on a burger, or something like that. And it's really bad for them, actually. So there are a lot of problems with the fast food industry, and in the scheme of carbon footprint, there are also a lot of problems because of how they choose to select the foods they sell there. Fast food industries are, I believe, the ones that are purchasing the most potatoes and meat, and I think it's potatoes and meat out of pretty much anyone. And that's really harmful. And so even if you go to a restaurant and you decide to pick the choice that's vegan there, that's great. And that's definitely something you should do if you want to do that. But at the same time, if you want to go a step further, don't go to that restaurant. Choose something else.
All right. I don't think it's fair for me to ask you, because we're related. So I think that it would be unfair for me to question you. So I got a question about the lawsuit. So you've talked a little bit about you've talked a lot about the lawsuit in Washington, and you mentioned how there's been successes in like Texas and stuff. So how do you view the progression of these state by state lawsuits to the national level? How do you see the future of recognizing these rights at the Supreme Court level? How do you see that going?
Yeah, oh man. That's such a good question. And, law is slow. It took Native American tribes, they've been litigating their right to fish for over 100 years. They first had to litigate their right to stand in a place. Then they had to litigate the right to use a dip net. Then they had to use their right to use a horse seine. Then they had to litigate their right to use a gill net. Now they've had to litigate their right to actually have fish in the streams at all. And that has literally been going on for over 100 years. We do not have that time. So, that's why, our approach is we're filing all of these cases because we need to speed up the clock on litigation. And whether the strategy will work, I don't know. I hope so. I mean, we can't lose these cases. So the Supreme Court, we wrote our case for Justice Antonin Kennedy because he recognizes that there are attributes of American liberty that aren't just about freedom from being in custody. He recognized that liberty included the right to marry who you want to marry, regardless of their gender. So that's how we authored our case. His last act as a sitting justice on July 30th, 2018, was to let our case go forward to trial. He denied their petition for writ of mandamus, but then he retired. So our court is very different now, and what's key to our success is likely going to be Chief Judge Justice Roberts and how he will view our claims. Our claims are actually fairly conservative. Like we had there. This is not an environmental rights case. This is a human rights case. And Chief Justice Roberts is someone who cares very deeply about the justice system, and he cares very deeply about children. But there's also some justices on the Supreme Court that are frankly very, very difficult to move on this issue. And whether we'll be able to succeed, I mean, we're doing our best, and we have the best evidence. We have to get to trial. A trial in this case is what will move things. A trial, getting these experts to testify, hearing the individual stories of the youth in a court of law, they were all deposed. So, having that is what will move things. I think even more so than a final decision. So that's why we're so focused on getting there. And then also what matters to the Supreme Court is that they get issues. They don't like to be ahead of their time. They like to be behind its time. So by the time they issued Brown versus Board of Education, the civil rights movement was heading in a certain direction. Same thing with Obergefell, the gay marriage decision. Things were happening in the movement, and the Supreme Court does not want to be the first word. They like to be the last word. So that means as a movement, we've got to speed up. And that's why the Green New Deal is so powerful and the youth climate strikes, because that's making it a movement. And it's not just a fringe thing that the Supreme Court's just going to say, this isn't happening. This isn't part of American culture. We need to have that fully before them if we're going to get what we need to get from the Supreme Court. So that puts the pressure on all of us to get there.
All right, we have to wrap up so that we can finish on time today. Let's give a hand to our speakers today.
Market.
Yeah, we've got farmers market. Yeah. Ted, go ahead. Another slide. Yeah. So just a reminder that we have one more Movies That Matter for this season. It's called Paris to Pittsburgh. I haven't seen it. I don't know what it's about, but it's at the library this Thursday, and I will hopefully be there. Next slide. So future climate and energy forums. As I mentioned earlier, if you have ideas for future forums, if you didn't put it on the forum here, you can email us at this address here, info@bainbridgeislandforum.org. We are going to have a forum drilling into the carbon inventory. I'm sure most of you know that the city has hired a company to do an inventory for the carbon emissions on Bainbridge Island. We should have the results of that in another week or so, or month or so. So we'll have one where we go into the details on that. And then talking about our local solutions, we're going to have one focusing on transportation again. Next slide. I would just like to let you guys know who's been organizing these forums. So when you see these people around town, maybe you can go up to them and thank them. This is the group of people from those organizations I talked about at the beginning who are sponsoring it, who have put the work into putting these forums together. And I'd like to give a special thanks to John McKenzie, the guy who takes our video, most of these, and he does a great job of editing them together with the slides and the speakers, and we put most of them, well, all of them that we get filmed, which is most of them, we make them available on our website up there. And next slide. And your call to action for today is, we've taken care of the fee for the church today, organization, so please, instead of donating to the church, make an even bigger donation to Our Children's Trust, because you've heard about the great work that they're doing. And then you can take steps to reduce your own carbon footprint and get involved in one of these local groups here. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in September.